just stand up for a second in your seat and stretch? Again, I'm Dr. Zeig, Jeff Zeig, the director of the Milton Erickson Foundation in Phoenix, and have the honor and the pleasure of hosting this evening's session. Our next keynote speaker is Dr. James Garbarino, and Dr. Garbarino has written a number of books, the most recent of which is his book, Parents Under Siege, Why You Are the Solution, Not the Problem in Your Child's Life. And Dr. Gabardino's one of his other books is a book, Lost Boys, and speaks, as Mary had spoken, to some of the issues of adolescence in girls. He speaks to some of the issues of temperament in children, and then more recently, how as parents we can make things happen better in the lives of our children. So please welcome Dr. Gabardino, who is a professor at Cornell, is it? And he'll be speaking to us about Parents Under Siege, why do bad things happen to good parents, and what can we do about
it? Well, names are very interesting things. When I was president of the Erickson Institute in Chicago for 9 years, a constant problem was the fact that people wanted to spell Eric Erickson the way they spell Milton Erickson. And so for years I found myself trying to extract the C from Erickson because Eric Erickson is E-R-I-K-S-O-N. Somehow there's a certain resonance in that, since there are no D's in my name. It is Garbarino, not Garbardino. But be that as it may. Meaning. The meaning is something that I struggle with a great deal, in part because much of my work takes me to places where issues of meaning are difficult to resolve. As an expert witness in murder trials, often visiting death row, interviewing men who are sentenced to be killed for what they have done, often because they're being given a chance for a retrial. I think a lot about meaning, and I, over the years, am drawn to other people's attempts to resolve the questions of meaning when faced with horror. One of my mentors was a Unitarian minister, Max Kutz, who spoke often about his own theological mentor, the German-American Protestant theologian Reinhold Niebuhr, who taught at Union Theological Seminary and wrote books like The Children of Light and The Children of Darkness. Niebuhr, I think, captured the sort of ambivalence that many of us face if we deal with horror and yet wish to remain hopeful. Niebuhr would lecture my friend Max Kutz and the other students every morning about the futility of seeking transformation and goodness in the world because of the allied forces of darkness. And then he would leave class and go march on picket lines for social justice. I think that kind of ambivalence was captured by another of my friends who said that to be a functioning person in the 20th century, you had to be an ambulatory schizophrenic, that you had to recognize all the bad things and yet still go out and do the good things. Now for me, this is an ongoing struggle, not just because of visiting men on death row and working on cases of child abuse, but because of the terrible things that surround us. We've heard some of them from Mary and heard some of them last night from the grandson of Gandhi. The fact that there is genocide every year, at least once, somewhere, big ones, small ones, many of them hardly even noticed. The fact that still, after all we know, many young people are stupid enough to start smoking every year, something which, how could you escape that it's a destructive and disgusting habit? Let alone the fact that in every men's room I've ever been into, men still pee on the toilet seats. Now this ought to be enough to discourage anyone. But nonetheless, we need to get up. We need to commit ourselves every day to understanding and doing good deeds. Maybe we carry around in our wallets inspirational words. I carry around in my wallet the bodhicitta vow that the Dalai Lama leads people in of signing on to and committing to. The last paragraph of which, as long as space, as long as sentient beings remain, until then may I too remain and dispel the miseries of the world. It's a worthy goal. But as Americans and North Americans, and I realize Mary was speaking to us as Americans, but there are certainly many blessed Canadians in the group, we face a lot of challenges here, cultural impediments of many sorts. One certainly is the fact that in many ways our rhetoric about these issues has become perhaps too psychologized in many ways. And it's hard, as is evident by some of the speakers in this meeting, to insert some of the traditional sources of meaning into the dialogue, the issues of spirituality in particular. I carry around a cartoon that appeared in, I think it was some American psychological publication some years ago. Some of you may recall it. It's one of the great heroic figures in American culture, Lassie, the dog, standing on the shore of a river as a man, apparently drowning, calls out for help, and he yells, "Lassie, get help." And the second piece is Lassie on a couch in a psychiatrist's office, seeking help. There has to be more help than that. And I think one place to begin is to focus on the cultural impediment we have, certainly as Americans, maybe even as North Americans, although I know it is less of a problem in Canada than it is in the United States, and that is in differentiating between sentimentality and compassion, words which are often used interchangeably, but in fact have very different meanings and roots. I think once again, His Holiness Dalai Lama is very eloquent and articulate in saying that compassion is not simply good feelings. Compassion is based on deep understanding, because being based on deep understanding, it doesn't have the fragile quality that sentimentality has. That true compassion is not dispelled by bad action of the other, if that bad action can be understood. Now, I sort of understood this rhetorically, but understood it more deeply about a year ago when I was asked to testify in the sentencing hearing of Nathaniel Brazil. You may remember Nathaniel Brazil was that 13-year-old boy in South Florida who shot and killed his teacher on the last day of school. It's captured on videotape at point-blank range, just shoots him right in the head. Well, when it came time for the trial, there was no doubt that he had done this, so the only issue was the sentence. It being the United States, it being Florida, this troubled 13-year-old boy was, of course, tried as an adult, which, of course, is another cultural irony. Typically, we define adulthood in terms of the assumption of responsibility. And yet in the criminal justice system, the more immature and irresponsible the act, the more likely a child is to be defined as an adult. So the 13-year-old was tried as an adult, and the judge had open to him a pretty narrow range of sentences. The minimum was 25 years. The maximum was life. Now, the death penalty was off the table, but here was what the judge was faced with. And part of the hearing was for the friends and the relatives of the dead teacher to have a chance to have their say about what should happen. Now, it's almost too ironic, given whose last night's speaker was, that this teacher was apparently as wonderful a human being as ever walked the planet, and his death was a great loss to everyone. In the town of Lake Worth, Florida, where he lived, he was so wonderful, so beloved, that he was known as the Gandhi of Lake Worth. So the Gandhi of Lake Worth has been killed, as the Gandhi of India was as well. And now the relatives and friends had an opportunity to say what they wanted to happen to and for this 13-year-old boy. And to a person, they wanted the maximum penalty. I'm sure if the death penalty had been on the table, many of them would have wanted that. One of the Gandhi of Lakesworth's best friends said that he wanted, quote, this boy to be raped and tortured every day for the rest of his life. Of course, for killing the Gandhi of Lakeworth. Now, certainly we know what the Gandhi of India would have wanted for the man who killed him. He wanted us protected, but he would have wanted him healed. There's no doubt about that. And so the irony of the Gandhi of Lakeworth being spoken for in these terms of retribution and hate and destruction were really pretty devastating. But what I realized in listening was that had these same people met this boy a week before the shooting, their hearts would have gone out to him. This poor pathetic boy whose life was coming unraveled. You know, his mother had cancer, she had had surgery, her stitches opened up and she bled all over this boy at one point. He thought she was dying. You know, there's no father. There's all the buildup of sort of human garbage in his life that drags people down. His life was coming unraveled. Had they met him a week before he killed the teacher, their hearts would have gone out to him. Probably one of them would have wanted to be his mentor, for heaven's sake. But the minute he did something which is comprehensible given a full and deep understanding of his life, they want him raped and tortured for the rest of his life. So it became crystal clear that what they had and felt was sentimentality, this kind of cheap, easy, fragile emotion, but they didn't have compassion. And compassion is a difficult sell in American culture. I want to speak specifically tonight about one case study of compassion, and that is the compassion that is needed for parents whose kids turn out badly. In a sense, this starts with one very specific family. On April 20th, 1999, a book I authored called Lost Boys, Why Our Sons Turn Violent and How We Can Save Them, was coming out. It reached the desk of journalists that morning. Just happened to. Well, that afternoon, the Columbine high school shootings took place. The worst mass murder by American teenagers sort of in our recorded history. Well, a number of people who might not have paid attention to this book did. One of the sets of people who did were the parents of one of the school shooters in the Columbine massacre, the parents of Dylan Klebold. And they went to this book desperately seeking to find some meaning for what had happened to their family. They woke up one morning and their beloved son said goodbye, walked out the door, and became the worst mass murder in American adolescent history. And they were desperate to find some meaning in this. Meaning in two senses. Meaning in the sense of how could you understand a universe in which this could happen, but also meaning in the sense of how could they, parents who didn't abuse their child, who loved their child, who were married, were middle class, who went to their soccer games, who read him books at night, who played with him, how could their son become this terrible thing? Well, my partner Claire Bedard and I interviewed the Klebold parents, spent time at their home, looked at home videos and photo albums, and tried to understand with them to give some meaning to what had happened. And we left with a sense that although obviously they were responsible, it was their child, they weren't to blame. And we came away with a greater appreciation for the need for compassion in the sense of deep understanding, to understand why bad things can happen to essentially okay parents. Now, this became the instigation for this book, Parents Under Siege. And in many ways, the Klebolds are sort of the ultimate case study of that. But in fact, they're not alone. A survey done just a few years ago found that about 1 in 5 parents in America says that they have at least one child at home who is so difficult it makes it about impossible to lead a normal life. So this is millions and millions of parents living in terror for what their children will do and become. I mean, I've interviewed parents, I'm sure many of you have. Virtually no parent starts off life looking at their newborn and saying, oh, there you are, so welcome to the world. I just can't wait, in 16 years I'll be visiting you in prison. Claire and I were visiting a boy in prison in Washington State last week, and an enormous visiting room like this, full of parents and children visiting people in prison. And most people don't start off that way. Parents don't look at their newborns and think, 15 years from now you'll be hooked on drugs and I'll come to claim your body at the morgue. This isn't how people start. They don't start out thinking, there you are, loving, cooing, giggling baby. 16 years from now you'll storm out of the house, slam the door and say, fuck you up and never see you again, ever. This isn't what people have in mind, and yet this is a common outcome. So I began to try to deal with the question, to make sense of the question, why don't good intentions on the part of parents automatically translate into good outcomes? And I want to speak to maybe 7 impediments, 7 things that stand between good outcomes and good intentions on the part of parents. The first is the fact that parental knowledge is imperfect. Parental knowledge of the developmental process is imperfect. Now that's not simply because they don't go to enough lectures or they slept through Child Development 101 or they haven't read enough of our books. It's because the process of development is fundamentally complex. So complex that if we ask the question in human development, does X cause Y? The best scientific answer is almost always, it depends. Because rarely is the process of cause-effect the same in every context, with every individual, in every historical and cultural period. All the categories of human identity influence the causal process: gender, class, race, age, biology. A couple of examples. One, to start with, it's sort of cute and provocative. Eleanor Maccabee, one of the giants in human development studies, years ago, 30 years ago, did a study in which she asked, does the amount of babbling an infant does predict how smart that infant will become? Does the amount of infant babbling predict IQ at age 5? And the answer, of course, was, it depends. It's sort of a trick question. That's always the answer. It depends. She found that for girl babies, the more they babbled, the higher their IQ at age 5. But for boy babies, there was no correlation whatsoever. That apparently verbal behavior was the pathway to intellectual development for girls, but boys went somewhere else to get there. Kind of provocative. Particularly if you add to the fact that in utero, the jaws of female fetuses develop and begin to move before the jaws of male fetuses. So this may start very early. It depends. And this, of course, runs the gamut, in every possible domain. It depends. Even things like effective child-rearing. In the 1920s, a researcher named Simons did a study in which he asked, which kind of child-rearing produces the most effective, competent, well-adjusted children? And he found that permissive child-rearing produced the most effective, competent, successful, happy children. Permissive parenting, good. By the 1960s, Diana Baumrein, using much the same approach, found that permissive parents produced the least successful, least competent, least high-achieving kids. Permissive parenting, bad. Well, which is it? Well, it depends. Best explanation seems to be that in the 1920s, the social world outside the home was very rigid and authoritarian. And a permissive child-rearing style at home was a kind of breath of fresh air, because the issue was, would children be over-controlled? But by the 1960s, with the world outside the home becoming more and more chaotic, the question becomes, will children be under-controlled? And they need more authoritative parenting to compensate for the chaotic social world outside the home. Well, this speaks to the fact that the process of development is fundamentally complex, and therefore parental knowledge is almost always imperfect. And it speaks to the fact to need to encourage and support parents in a kind of experimental approach to child rearing, an observational approach to figure out how to match what they do to the situation they face. And all the various studies of risk accumulation and developmental assets and all of that speak to our ability to get closer and closer to identifying what we're actually dealing with. And the closer we come to that, the more readily we can predict that X will produce Y, if we know as much as we can. The second impediment is that children show up with different temperaments. Temperament, of course, is the package of attributes that kids show up with: active, passive, impulsive, reflective. Now, people who don't actually have any children perhaps dismiss the importance of temperament. They think all children are alike. Some people with one child dismiss temperament. They think their child is the way children are. But mostly people with two or more children come to appreciate the importance of temperament. They say, look, I swear to God I didn't do it. They showed up this way. I got an apple, an orange, a banana. Really, I didn't. They just arrived like that. Now, I have two biological children. My daughter, in her college entrance essay, writes that she was the Mercedes-Benz of babies. And it's an apt description. This was a child who, from the word go, was so well put together and organized, she just cruises right along. She writes in the essay that her brother, my son, was like an MG sports car we used to have. Very exciting, but prone to breakdown. Now, I love both these cars. These are both wonderful cars, but they are very different. And she's right. She was a sort of easy baby. He was a difficult one. And if you go back to the classic research of Chesson Thomas, you may remember that among easy babies, only 10% had significant adjustment problems by elementary school. So if you're the parent of an easy baby, life looks pretty good. You wake up every morning thinking, what new evidence of my competence as a parent will I be treated to today? You know? Oh, it's teacher conference day. I love teacher conference day. Because you will walk into a smiling, relaxed teacher who will say, oh, Mr. and Mrs. Jones, it's so wonderful to have Jenny in our class. She's reading above grade level. She's playing the violin. Her locker is neat. She fed the rabbit every day this week. The implication being, you must be a great parent. Among difficult babies, Chesson Thomas found that 70% had significant adjustment problems by elementary school. And now life looks very different. You wake up thinking, oh my God, it's teacher conference day. What's it going to be this time? And you know that you will walk in to find a tight-lipped teacher who will say, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, we're worried about Timmy. He's not reading well. He broke his violin. His locker is a mess. And he killed the rabbit. And the finger is implicitly there because you must be a bad parent. Well, the point is that temperament creates challenges, and the more modern rendering of these difficult temperaments is as challenge. Stanley Greenspan has a book called The Challenging Child, which he talks about 5 or 6 different kinds of difficult temperaments and how to succeed with each. And of course, that's the issue, is how to understand the child's temperament and to respond effectively to it. And that draws us into a whole set of supports that parents need to do that. One is to help parents see the child they actually have. Not the child they wish they had, not the child they were, not the child their sister has, but the child in front of them. And then to recognize that every child has a fundamental need for acceptance, regardless of their temperament. Now, if the child walks in and says, Mom, Dad, you know, I cleaned my room, here's my A report card, give me a hug, any idiot can hug that child. But it's the child who walks in and says, Mom, Dad, I flunked my courses, my room's a mess, give me a hug. That requires a higher level of consciousness. But the child's need for acceptance is no smaller. One tool that some have proposed for doing that is to structure our language to convey acceptance even while we seek to change. Somebody gave me one of these lists. It's on the left-hand column are temperamental characteristics of children in negative terms. And the right-hand column are the same characteristics rendered in a positive way. Now think which child hears acceptance more. The child who is defined as defiant, clingy, crabby, sneaky, domineering, and can't sit still, or the same child who is courageous, connected, speaks out their needs, is inventive, creative, charismatic, and energetic. Well, anyone would rather be the second child, but of course they are the same child. To couch Language and response to the temperamental variations of children is certainly one of the keys for narrowing the gap between good intentions and good outcomes. And the more parents are locked into repetitive, unchanging strategies, the more likely they are to get into trouble. So we need to find ways to help parents see that and be willing to do that. And to recognize, to have the humility to recognize that some temperamental loadings are so heavy that almost any parent will not succeed with the child. Ross Greene's book speaks to that, about impossible children. Many of you remember if you run your fingernails on a blackboard, this excruciating aversive sound and feeling it conveys. Well, some children are wired to experience the world that way 24 hours a day. No wonder they're so difficult, and no wonder it takes heroic efforts to cope with them, and why individual parents will probably not be able to do that unless they are brilliant, genius saints, and how many of us are. Now, there may be ideological dimensions to the acceptance required for temperamental variations. A major example, of course, is children who are born destined for gay and lesbian identities. We still have great trouble accepting those children, institutionally as well as in families. And yet those variations require acceptance to at least the same degree. A third impediment that we have to recognize and face up to is the fact that children have secret lives. Secret lives. This was one of the astounding things about Dylan Klebold. The boy was a genius in creating and maintaining a life separate from the awareness of his parents. And it wasn't really because they were stupid or because they were blind. It was because really he was such a genius at it, that he kept all the weapons outside of their home, that he presented this false front to his parents. 3 weeks before the massacre, when all the weapons had been bought and all the plans were in place and all the videotapes had been made, he went off to college with his parents to pick out his dorm room at Arizona State University, just like any other kid in the spring of his senior year of high school. Came back with a T-shirt, Arizona State University, talking about his roommate, lulling his parents into a false sense of normality about their son. He was damn good at it. Well, one of the things we did in response to this was to sort of ask, how common is it for teenagers to have secret lives? And we know anecdotally that almost all of us could point to things that we kept secret from our parents in adolescence. But we asked more systematically. We asked Cornell University students in my classes about their secret lives. These are obviously adolescents who've been competent enough and held it together enough to get into an Ivy League university and stay there. What about their secret lives? And we found in these students that their parents are unaware of. 30% of the female students say that at some point in high school, they were so depressed and troubled they seriously contemplated suicide. And 70% say their parents never knew. 40% of the male students say they engaged in an act of larceny. They stole something that they could have gone to prison for if they'd been caught. And 85% say their parents never knew. Being arrested, being detained by the police, having abortions, attempting suicide. All of these things were occurring in greater or lesser degree, and in many cases, a majority of kids say their parents never knew. One item was, realize that you were gay or lesbian. And 10% of the male students and 10% of the female students said they realized they were gay or lesbian in high school. In the case of the male students, 65% say their parents never knew. In the case of the female students, 90% of their parents say they never knew. Something fundamental about their identity. Now, when this book, Parents Under Siege, was first coming out, one of the national journalists was doing an interview, and she said, well, I can't really buy this. A good parent would know about their child. And I said to her, well, each year, thousands and thousands of husbands and wives discover their spouse is having an affair. to me. And she wrote a very different story once you could empathize with this. Almost every time I talk about this, afterwards signing books, somebody comes up with a story. Recently, a guy came up and said, 2 months ago, I got the state award for the best drug counselor in our state. And 2 weeks later, I found out my son had been hooked on heroin for 3 weeks, or a month, or whatever it was. It's not through blindness or ignorance, it's through the fact that normally kids develop awareness and neural it happens very normally. The child at the kitchen table with a fish sandwich in front of them. Mom and dad goes down to change the laundry. And while they're down there, the dog comes up and asks for the sandwich, and the kid gives the sandwich to the dog. And mom and dad comes up and says, "Oh, honey, you ate your lunch." And the kid goes, "Yeah, that's it. I ate my lunch." And they realize their mother or father cannot see inside their brain. Now, maybe they'll smell the dog's breath. But this is an important insight for a child, and we all have it at an earlier or later point. But it creates the potential to create a secret life. What is the antidote to this? Well, some people say parental monitoring is the antidote. But some very good studies of adolescent monitoring, monitor teenagers, is what kids self-disclose. And if they don't self-disclose, you don't learn much. Now, the only sort of hopeful sign in that research is that the author is maybe in an act of hope, said, well, if you start in early childhood with a tradition of disclosure, which essentially means teaching the child there is nothing that you could do, there is nothing that you could feel, there is nothing that could happen to you that would make me stop loving you, then maybe you'll end up with a teenager who's confident enough to disclose even the bad stuff. Other kids may be a source of information, but not very helpful most of the time. After all the school shootings we have had in the United States in the last 10 years, still a survey within the last year found that a majority of high school students said in the survey, if they overheard a friend of theirs talking about killing someone, they would not tell an adult. So this is a major issue. A fourth impediment. Parents are people. People are imperfect. Imperfect meaning that we don't always live up to our highest standards, that we get distracted, that we get preoccupied, that we have our own issues, that we're not fully present when we need to be, that we're not perfect. How many people in this room are parents? Would you raise your hand if you're a parent? Now, only keep your hand up if you're a perfect parent. There's usually one wise guy in there, usually a grandparent. But except for him, the rest of us acknowledge we are imperfect. I'll give you an example. There was a case in Phoenix, Arizona a couple of years ago. A 14-year-old boy showed up at a school with a pistol and a mask and took his classroom hostage. Now, he was in crisis with his family, and somehow he thought this was going to make things better. This is why we don't put 14-year-olds in charge of things. Because in his head, taking a pistol to school, taking the class hostage would solve his family problem. Well, when we interviewed this boy, I noticed in the police transcript he had said when the SWAT team arrested him, "I wish I was never born." Well, a kid who says, wish I was never born, we ought to wonder, who told him that? How did he draw that conclusion? So we asked, who told you that? Long, painful pause. He says, my mother. Well, boy, you think your mother wishes you were never born, that's as bad as it gets. There was a study done in Eastern Europe a number of years ago of women who applied for abortions and didn't get official permission and so had to go through with the birth. And they followed the psychosocial development of those kids whose mothers really wished they weren't born. And it showed in the negative outcomes. So this boy thought that. Well, when the mother was asked about this, she just about died. That her son thought she wished he was never born? Well, when she finally regained her composure, the interviews tried out, how could he think this? And she remembered a time, actually not that long before the incident when he took the classroom hostage, where this is a kid who was really mouthing off and disobedient, wasn't going to school, just, you're a nightmare of a teenager, She's sort of stuck in the house with him and his younger sister. The father's off working 60 hours a week, One day they're just at each other, and he said to her, "I bet you wish I was never born, don't you?" And she, being an imperfect human being, said, "Well, sometimes I almost do." And then, of course, wanted to bite her tongue off. But he heard his worst fears confirmed. A study a number of years ago asked junior high school kids, if you could ask your parents one question that you'd like to know the answer to but don't feel you could really ask, what would that question be? And the most common response was kids would ask, "Do you really love me?" Probably particularly a question junior high school kids would ask, because it's a time when even they know they're largely unlovable in many cases. Well, here was a kid who heard the worst answer he could get because his mother was an imperfect person. Now, she might have gone back the next day and tried to repair the damage. She might have read the work of Gerald Patterson and gotten others. No, it takes 5 positive interactions in the bank to outweigh each one negative one, but the damage was done. The nice end to this story is, though, the kid's arrested, and of course, in our great wisdom, we try him as an adult too, for the mature act of coming to school with a pistol to take the classroom hostage. And here he is, he's facing, 21 counts of kidnapping, like 11,000 years in prison if convicted, He's a kid's in a terrible state. And he reports that his parents came to visit him for the first time. And he says, I thought this was it. It was all over. My life was completely over now. Instead, his parents came in and said, we love you, we're going to stick by you no matter what. He's sitting there facing 11,000 years in prison, he's in chains, but this was the best day in his life because he had answered in unequivocal terms the most profound question a kid could have. Well, impediment number 5. The breakdown, or the erosion at least, in the structure of adult authority. This is an impediment for good intentions translating into outcomes that parents want, because if the structure of adult authority is intact, parents are more likely to get what they ask for. But if the structure of adult authority erodes or breaks down, what you want is less likely what you will get. Now, there are many ways of beginning to approach this topic of the erosion in the structure of adult authority. Let me give you a sort of story. When I was 17, that's 38 years ago, I used to write a column for my high school newspaper. One week I wrote a column in which I made fun of the fraternities in my high school. Certainly in retrospect, bad idea, because I listed a lot of anger and hostility from teenager boys in my high school, which is never a good idea. And so the next night at midnight, a car pulled up in front of our house, and these angry teenagers dumped garbage on the lawn of our house as an act of intimidation. In today's language, you would say I was the victim of a drive-by littering. Well, the next morning when my father saw this garbage on the lawn, he figured he knew at least one of the boys responsible. Dennis Policastro was his name, kind of an up-and-coming thug. My father, in his slippers and bathrobe, marched up to Dennis's house. "You come out here and clean it up," he said. And he did. Now you think today how many fathers would feel authorized and brave enough and powerful enough to do that? And the answer is far fewer. But it never occurred to my father that Dennis would not come out and pick up the garbage, because my father was an adult, and there was, to some degree, an intact structure of adult authority. I was reviewing a research study recently on kids skipping class in high school, which by most accounts is more common than it used to be in some places. But what was striking was when the kids were apprehended and interviewed and said, "All right, we caught you skipping class, what do you have to say for yourself?" One of the most common answers was, "Well, who are you to tell us to go to class in the first place?" Excuse me? I'm sure 25, 30 years ago, people would have come up with different answers, but they would not have negated adult authority to tell them to be in school, because there was a sense, these are the adults, they're in charge here. if we've completely lost track of this, you read a book like John Grisham's novel, A Painted House. Lovely little novel, very different from most of it. It's not about lawyers. It's about a little boy growing up in Arkansas, I think, on a tobacco farm. And one of the striking things about the book is how intact the structure of adult authority is in his family and his community. This boy goes through some very dangerous, traumatic experiences, but he knows that if he shares it and puts it in the hands of his parents and grandparents, it will be okay because they know what they're doing. What a refreshing world to live in, as opposed to the world kids live in today, where they may have a sense of, hey, adults are just big kids who dress badly, Well, there's not a lot of direct data about this. There are surveys. A survey done a few years ago asked the question of American adults, one of these nostalgia surveys that asked, compared to when you were a child, are kids today more respectful of adult authority, less respectful of adult authority, or about the same? Let's try it out on you. Compared to when you were a child, how many people would say kids today are more respectful of adult authority? There's no hands. Well, that's good. It's good to know no one here is delusional. Not to make light of being delusional, it's a serious thing, but it's kind of reassuring since we're all locked in one room together. How many of you would say kids today are less respectful of adult authority? Most hands. How many would say about the same? And there's always some hands for that. It depends. Thank you. That's right. There's always two wise guys, him and you. Well, here's the national data. 82% thought kids were less respectful of adult authority. 15% thought kids were about the same. And 2% thought kids were more respectful, which is about the percentage of the population who is delusional in any given moment. These are the same people who think aliens live with Elvis Presley in their basement. And they also think kids are more respectful of adult authority. If you're adding up, there's 1% missing. That was the don't know. But since you're all professionals, it's not an option. You can't not know. Well, where is this coming from? Mary spoke to some of this. Some of this erosion, I think, is through the media environment. The lowering of standards, the modeling of getting away with lower and lower standards about the treatment of adults by kids. Some of it, I think, comes directly through parenting practices. A prime example, of course, would be the OK syndrome. That's when you take what should be directive, declarative statements and turn them into weak questions through the use of the word OK. As in, eat your beans now, okay? It's time to go to bed now, okay? Get in the car now, okay? The net effect of which is, I have no idea what I'm doing here, kid, help me out. Should it come as any surprise that with a constant barrage of the weak question, okay, kids reach adolescence saying, who are you to tell me what to do? You didn't even know if I should eat my beans. Remember, Gregory Bateson said that the double bind drives people crazy. And a lot of the okay questions have that character to them. Recently I was in a building and there was a woman on this floor, and at the bottom of the stairs was her 4-year-old son. And she said, come on up now, okay? He said, no. And she got upset. I said, hey, you asked the question, lady. It's like with lawyers. Don't ask the question unless you know the answer is going to be what you want. And of course, eventually you can end up with teenagers who are really at risk because they have no sense of respect for adult authority. And they put themselves in very dangerous situations because they won't do what you tell them to do. Temperamental factors play a role, of course. But experiential factors in the family and in the larger culture play a role as well. Impediment number 6. Moralizing is not moral development. If you look at the research on moral values, moral reasoning, moral thinking, and moral behavior, one of the striking findings has always been what a weak correlation there is between those two factors. That you get people with great moral reasoning and moral values, but lousy moral behavior in practice. Why? Well, I think one of the important reasons is there's a missing element in that equation, and that is something that we can call the circle of caring. The circle of caring means the domain in which issues are defined as moral issues. Outside of the circle of caring, they are not. And this really became apparent to me interviewing kids who kill, because people often say, don't those boys know the difference between right and wrong? And over time I came to realize that's not the right question. Because they often have very strong ideas of right and wrong. They may really be called moralistic. What they don't do is apply those moral standards in a very broad setting, and certainly not in settings that we think they should apply them in. Here's what I mean by the circle of caring. Some of you will remember a movie called 7 Years in Tibet. Brad Pitt plays a European who becomes a friend of the young Dalai Lama. There's a very pivotal scene in which the Dalai Lama wants him to build a movie theater. And so Brad Pitt, the European, takes on this task. He gets a bunch of workmen together with shovels, and they begin to dig a trench for the foundation for the movie theater. And a bunch of Tibetan Buddhist monks come up and say, stop, you can't do this. And he says, why? He says, well, with the shovels, you're killing the worms. He says, your point being? And they say, well, the way we look at the world, every being is entitled to our respect and caring. But not for the European Brad Pitt. For the European, killing the worms is not a moral issue. It is purely a logistical issue. He's doing what he has to do. And if a few worms get killed, they're collateral damage. Why? Because for the Tibetan Buddhist monks, the circle of caring is enormous. The aspiration is to make it cover all beings. As it says in the end of the Bodhicitta vow, as long as space remains, as long as sentient beings remain. It doesn't say sentient beings who are also American citizens or sentient beings who haven't committed a felony. It's all sentient beings. The circle of caring defines what is a moral issue and what is not a moral issue. You may remember that a week after September 11th, a CBS News New York Times poll asked a representative sample of American adults, do you favor military retaliation even if it means, quote, thousands of innocent civilians are killed? And I think it was 63% of Americans said yes. In effect saying that the collateral damage was a logistical necessity and it was not a moral issue. Some years ago, I was speaking to the American Humane Association, and the talk was on the links between animal abuse and child abuse, which many people have explored in various ways. So I was really wrestling with issues of animal rights and children's rights and all that sort of stuff. At the end of my talk, a woman comes up and says, I have a question. I said, what is it? She says, are you a vegetarian? I said, no. She said, I bet if you keep working on this issue, you will be, because eventually I want you to answer this question. Why is it fundamentally different as a moral issue to kill and eat a cow than to kill and eat your nephew? You laugh. I thought it was a pretty wacky question too, 12 years ago. But years passed in which I thought about this issue some more, and my range of animals in my house increased. I had a cockatiel who sat on one shoulder and a gray Norwegian rat who sat on the other shoulder, and I had lizards I fed by hand, and I really worked on this issue both intellectually and empathically a great deal. Well, 10 years later, whatever it was, I'm giving another speech to the same group on the same topic, and I finish my speech, and there's the same woman. She says to me, well, I said, all right, I'm a vegetarian. What you predicted would happen, happened. Now, I used to love to go fishing as a child, but I can't go fishing anymore. I miss it. The damn fish got inside the circle of caring. Now, fishing is a very interesting example for this topic. Why? Because why can so many otherwise gentle, caring, loving people fish? because fish come out of the water silently. You know, in Hebrew, the words for silence and violence are linked words, because that is one way to keep beings outside the circle of caring, is to keep them silent. If fish came out of the water screaming bloody murder, "Oh my God, cut it out, you're killing me with that hook." You know, who'd be out fishing? Hannibal Lecter? There's an animal rights group in Toronto that had a big billboard on the Gardner Expressway. It's a picture of a yellow Labrador Retriever, you know, North America's most beloved dog, with a fish hook in its mouth. And the slogan says, "Why don't we fish for dogs?" Because dogs would scream bloody murder and you'd feel like a monster fishing for dogs. But there are people who in effect fish for dogs, aren't there? There are underground dog fighting businesses all over North America, in which dogs are thrown in to rip each other's throats out. And people sit by and enjoy it because they have blocked out those dogs from their circle of caring. If you read my book, Lost Boys, there's a boy interviewed, a very, very violent kid, who used to make money fighting dogs. But he had 2 dogs he didn't fight. He said they were his pets. It would be wrong to fight them. Well, over a period of 18 months of relationship, probably the first empathic relationship he'd ever been with, in one day he says, "You know, I'm going to have to get rid of my dogs because I can't fight them anymore." In effect, because of a little bit of empathic relationship, his circle of caring just grew enough to take in these dogs. And it dawned on him. And that's why historically, when we keep people silent, whether it's blacks or Indians or women or children, you keep them silent, you close off the avenue of empathy, and you keep them outside of the circle of caring, and you can indeed be a good person and still create moral havoc to other beings because they're outside the circle, and the pain they experience is not a moral issue, it is collateral damage or simply business as usual. Well, in our education of children, we often miss that part of it. We teach them about right and wrong and doing the right thing, but we forget that the circle of caring will have a lot to do with who's in and who's out. Impediment number 7. Impediment number 7 is the fact that the world outside the family may be socially toxic. And that social poisoning may impede the ability of parents to accomplish their higher goals with kids. For example, if one of your goals as a parent was to rear a child who, when they reached adulthood, would have good, clean lungs, and you lived in the shadow of a smokestack, that environmental toxin would impair your ability to translate your intention of good lungs into good breathing in your child. What we've learned now about secondhand smoke speaks to that. That's why there's all these poster campaigns of kids saying to parents, "Don't smoke in my presence because, it's my lungs that are getting it." Well, the same is probably true about social poisons, social toxins, if you will. The most thoroughly researched example of a social toxin, of course, is the impact of violent images on television on kids' aggressive behavior. Article in the American Psychologist just within the last year points out that the research linking TV violence to aggressive behaviors in kids is stronger than the research linking smoking to lung cancer. Stronger. That if you look at just research in the last 20 years or 15 years, that the amount of the variation in aggressive behavior accounted for by televised violence is greater than the amount of the variation in lung cancer accounted for by smoking. About 15% versus about 10%. 1 in 9 people who get lung cancer have never smoked a cigarette in their lives. Most people who smoke never get lung cancer. Some of them are damnably healthy. My mother is 77 years old. She was smoking. She just stopped 4 months ago. Now she'll probably get sick. But she was smoking since she was 15. She was so healthy, so robust, she claimed she was going to smoke on my grave. Now, is that anything for a mother to say to her son, I asked her. But even my demented mother would acknowledge that smoking was bad for people's health, that it caused cancer. Wouldn't affect her, of course, because she's an alien. It was actually very embarrassing in our family because my sister, her only daughter, heads up the state of Vermont's anti-smoking campaign. I would have to drag her cigarette-smoking mother along to all these events. So finally, out of shame, our mother stopped. But the point is, we know that smoking causes cancer. If we have an open mind about it and look at the evidence, we know that televised violence causes aggression. So any parent who seeks to raise a non-aggressive child who has a functioning television in their home, it's like living with a smokestack in your backyard or secondhand smoke. And that's not the only source of social toxicity. There is, of course, point-and-shoot video games. A new technology, but a new research that is catching up with that technology, demonstrating two things. One, that the games in which you hold the gun and shoot at figures on the screens effectively disinhibit violent behavior. They don't initiate it, but they disinhibit it. Some of you know some of this about, enough military psychology to know that until the 1960s, the biggest problem faced by armies was the fact that you teach soldiers to shoot at targets and you send them into combat and they won't shoot at the enemy. Only about 15 or 20% will shoot at the enemy. The rest of them shoot in the air, they shoot in the ground, they pretend to shoot, they don't shoot. So of course this is a problem if you're running a war. If 80% of your soldiers won't shoot at the enemy, so they changed the training. And they found that if you shoot repetitively at a human target, you break down the inhibition. And now you can get 90, 95% shooting rates. And what is the single most effective technology for achieving that? It is the point-and-shoot video game, which you point and shoot at the screen repeatedly. So there's sort of a clear emergent body there of evidence that Dave Grossman and others have pointed to. The second general effect that's emerging from all over the world, cultures all over the world, is that there is an effect of the violent, nasty, degrading, dehumanizing imagery on kids' images, on their behavior, on their arousal patterns, and all the rest of it. Some of you may have seen there was a Nightline program on last week about the biggest selling video game in America right now. It's called Grand Auto Theft 3, which is about as nasty and vicious as you could imagine, and then some. It includes a segment where you get points for finding this prostitute on the street, having sex with her, and then killing her, clubbing her to death, or blowing her head off to take the money back. And all these 13-year-olds blithely playing it away, saying this is as close as you can get to killing somebody without actually doing it, and how my palms sweat when I play this game. And yet, this toxic element is allowed to flow freely, as if we diverted the sewers to run right through the high school, and say, well, there's no effect, these are resilient kids. They can have sewage running through their high school. Cholera is not a big problem, or not too big a problem here. Well, there are other toxic elements, of course. I think one was mentioned before, and that's the materialist ethic that infuses so much of the day-to-day life of kids. I was interviewing one young fellow, 19-year-old, in a death penalty case. He'd killed a cop. He got life in prison. He said to me, when he got the verdict of life in prison, he said, I'm going to kill myself. I said, why? He said, because I'm never going to the mall again. Now, an extreme statement, but a representative statement of the consciousness of materialism in America. That you really are what you buy, what you wear, what you drive. What is the basic story of a human life? You're born, you live, you die. Or maybe there's a two-track system. You're born, have a nice day, go to the mall, and then you die. Or you're born, life sucks, and then you die. A guy once said to me in a death penalty case at age 30, I said, what have you learned from being on the planet for 30 years? He said, what have I learned? Life sucks. That's it. Well, as long as we accept the material definition of life, that's basically what there is out there to offer. It's only when we go beyond that to find deeper sources of meaning that we have something to put up against that. And certainly in the wake of catastrophe, people often realize that. You know, in the wake of September 11th, even a lot of Americans realize Madonna isn't enough to cope with September 11th. Something deeper. If you work in prisons, you know that guys sentenced to long-term prison sentences basically have one choice. Will you become a savage barbarian or you'll become a monk? And if you become a monk, it means that you look to deep cultural resources and spiritual development as a way to make your life go forward. But if you accept a purely material definition, you become a savage and a barbarian. Never forget one guy I met in prison, a young kid, 20 years old, probably had never read a book till he went to prison, but he stumbled onto Plato. He reads Plato's Republic. So we spent 2 hours talking about Plato's Republic. In particular, those of you who remember Plato's Republic may remember there's a very important segment called the allegory of the cave. It's about illusion and reality. Well, this kid had latched onto the allegory of the cave in Plato's Republic as a metaphor for his life as a gangbanger and his new life now as he saw things clearly. You know, without some kind of deep resource, he doesn't have the ability to make some sense of that. And of course, the deepest resource there can be is spiritual development, which I will come back to in a moment. Another aspect of social toxicity, of course, is the impulsiveness that is modeled and reinforced in our society, in our culture. Why? Because most people recognize that delay of gratification is one of the building blocks of civilization. You can't run a civilization unless people are willing and able to delay gratification, to study for a test, to stay in school, to not get pregnant until later on, to do this for a payoff later on. If you've read Daniel Goleman's book on emotional intelligence, you know that he says that delay of gratification is one of the building blocks of emotional intelligence. How important is it? Well, there's a classic study called the marshmallow study. Some of you no doubt familiar with. Obviously, they didn't use kids from Nigeria or wherever it was or Kenya in this study because most American kids like marshmallows. And in this study, you bring in 4-year-olds, you say, here's a marshmallow. And almost invariably they like them. You say, here's your choice. You can have 1 marshmallow now, or if you can wait until they come back from doing an errand, you can have 2 marshmallows. Well, some kids wait. Some kids gobble the marshmallow. Does it matter? Well, in that study, they found that 14 years later, the kids who waited for the second marshmallow had SAT scores 310 points higher than the kids who gobbled the 1 marshmallow. So forget the Kaplan SAT preparation course. Just get yourself a bag of marshmallows and train them up. Now, of course, delay of gratification to some degree reflects temperamental differences. Some people are impulsive, some are reflective from the word go. I'm a very impulsive person, always have been. Some people are reflective. But it also reflects training and skills. Kids learn how to delay gratification. And in fact, some of the videotapes of the marshmallow study have kids looking at the wall. If you don't look at the marshmallow, you won't eat it. Some kids sing to the marshmallow. You stay on the table, you're not coming in my mouth, because I want 2 of you later. I mean, you learn this. But also there is a sort of ideological dimension to delay of gratification. Some kids in the marshmallow studies will say, hey, in my neighborhood, they offer you 1 marshmallow, you take it, because they're not coming back with a second one. A colleague of mine, Steve Cece, studied poor children in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, who when assessed in school typically showed no capacity for delay of gratification. And he found the same children were saving their pennies for an entire year to buy their Mardi Gras costume. In a context in which they could see the payoff, they demonstrate the capacity. In school, which they didn't see as a payoff, they don't. Now think about the many ways in which the culture reinforces and models and stimulates impulsive rather than delay of gratification. And think about how it is taught in micro lessons every day. For example, I took a little 3-year-old to toddler story hour at the library last year. Now it's story hour for toddlers, so it's basically chaos and barbarism. But this is where civilization begins to take hold. Well, there's the children's librarian reading a story with a puppet in it. And she says at the end of the story, now children, at the end of the story hour, you can each take a turn playing with the puppet. And I'm thinking, way to go. Teaching delay of gratification. But the minute she puts the puppet, some kid rushes up to grab it. What does she do? She gives them the puppet. Down go the SAT. Every kid is saying, hey, the system doesn't work, you can't trust adults, you got to grab it or you're not going to get it. Now I'm sure when I was growing up, my children's librarian would have done it very differently. She would have taken that child and say, honey, you are now last. Thus teaching that child and every other child in the room, the system works. Adults do what they say. And they would have learned a micro lesson about delay of gratification. You magnify this over and over again, you begin to see how a socially toxic environment leads into undermining the development of kids and the goals of parents. Because parents want kids who will study, stay in school, not get pregnant, don't drive drunk. They want things. But impulsiveness can overwhelm that. And for some kids who are temperamentally prone to it, they need every cultural resource possible to restrain them. The last impediment is our neglect for the spiritual needs of children. Children are physical beings. If you don't meet their physical needs, if you don't give them the vitamins and the minerals and the calories, you get warped physical development. We know that children are psychological beings, and they have a virtually universal need for acceptance. Ronald Rohner, an anthropologist, studied rejection in 118 cultures around the world, and he found in every culture, kids who are rejected turn out badly. So much so that Rohner called rejection a psychological malignancy, a psychological cancer, because acceptance is a fundamental need. And kids will go to extraordinarily dangerous and painful activities to meet that need. A guy once said to a colleague of mine in prison, he said, I would rather be wanted for murder than not be wanted at all. And there's an ugly fundamental truth to that. Everybody's got to be accepted by somebody. So children have psychological needs, but they also have spiritual needs. They have a fundamental need to know they live in a meaningful universe, that there is something more to life than simply the material experience of it. They have a craving for this. They need it. And spiritually empty assurance that there is a structure of meaning to the universe are at great risk. The spiritually empty kid has a hole in his heart, and that hole will be filled by something. Not demonic, but it'll be something. A study in the Texas state prison system found 15% of the boys said that Satanism was their structure of meaning. That with nothing positive, they gravitate to that. Many of the school shooters were fans of, I always have trouble remembering his name, Marilyn Manson. Because here's a structure of meaning, demonic, but it fills the hole in their hearts. 2, kids who are spiritually empty don't have a sense of limits. Because in a material world, there's just you and me here. You make me. I want your coat. Give it up. or you will die. You're the clerk at 7-Eleven, money fast enough, you deserve to die. School, you humiliate me at school, you deserve to die. And it naturally engenders a sense of limits. Spiritually empty kid goes into emotional free fall. Because in effect, a spiritually grounded kid can say, things really may be lousy, but at least I live in a meaningful universe. And that is a resource, that is a developmental asset. I see that we can create meaning out of balls. That and say they love their child, he got up one morning and begin to dissect the development of that boy. Good intentions on the part of parents don't automatically translate into outcome. And that will provide meaning here to our jobs. Thank you.